My mother's hand, the one that wore my father's wedding band for over 40 years, was planted firmly on the manila folder that held his will. She looked straight at me, her eyes void of any grief, and filled instead with a chilling absolute certainty. Her words were like ice chips. "You're not getting a dime, Sarah." A profound calm washed over me, a kind of mental silence I hadn't felt in the years since my father's heart had given out. The rage that should have been there, the hot, furious anger, was simply gone. In its place was a perfect, cold clarity. A small, knowing smile crept onto my face. It was the one expression I had that she could never stand, because it was entirely my own. I pushed my chair back from the polished mahogany dining table, the same table where I'd struggled through algebra homework while my brother was praised for drawing on the walls. I met her gaze, that arctic stare that had frozen my defiance 1,000 times before. "In that case," I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's hand, "I truly hope you never need a dime from me." Before I tell you about the silence that fell in that room and the ruin it left in its wake, you have to understand the geology of my family. This wasn't some sudden, shocking event. This was the slow, grinding pressure of two worlds colliding for 3 decades. It's a story you've probably heard before, the tale of two children, the workhorse and the show pony. I was the workhorse. My younger brother, Ethan, was my mother's magnum opus. He was the free spirit, the creative genius, the boy who was always on the verge of greatness. That greatness, however, was a promise that never cleared the bank. My mother had a unique talent for reframing his spectacular failures as evidence of his artistic brilliance. When he dropped out of the University of Illinois after 2 semesters, it was because the institution was too rigid and was stifling his vision. When he incinerated a $30,000 education fund from our grandparents on a series of ventures that were frankly comical, including a failed attempt to become a documentarian that produced 30 seconds of usable footage and an online store selling artisanal small batch driftwood, it was because he was a pioneer who was just misunderstood by the market. I, on the other hand, was the pragmatist, the reliable one. I was the daughter who colored inside the lines. I paid my own way through community college and then night classes at DePaul University, working a 40-hour week as a bank teller. I started as a junior associate in the compliance department of a major Chicago bank and clawed my way up, rung by painful rung, to become a senior risk analyst. I built a stable, secure life for myself, not with handouts and applause, but with spreadsheets, late nights, and an unshakable sense of discipline. My successes were never moments for celebration. They were simply entries in a ledger, expected and unremarkable. "Well, of course you passed your certification exams, Sarah," my mother would say with a dismissive wave of her hand. "You've always been the sensible one." It wasn't a compliment, it was my function. I was the family's designated adult, the financial safety net they took for granted. While I was building a respectable 401k, Ethan was building a mountain of maxed out credit cards and broken leases. My father, bless his gentle soul, was the quiet counterbalance in our lopsided family. He was a man of quiet integrity who hated conflict, especially with my mother. He could never challenge her blatant favoritism head on, but he found his own ways to level the playing field. He'd slip me a gift card to a nice restaurant with a note that said, "For a nice meal out. Not for groceries, you deserve it, sweetheart." He saw the toxic dynamic. He knew my mother was enabling Ethan into a state of arrested development, but he was a man who valued peace above all. His quiet gestures were his attempts to keep the ship from capsizing. When he died from a sudden heart attack the previous spring, the ship's keel was gone. The quiet, stabilizing presence in our lives evaporated, and my mother's favoritism, now completely unmoored, became her sole navigational star. She looked at my father's life savings not as a family legacy, but as a dedicated trust fund to rescue her perpetually failing son. Which brings us back to that dinner. It was supposed to be a quiet memorial on the 1-year anniversary of Dad's death. My mother had prepared his favorite meal, a classic meatloaf with mashed potatoes and green beans. The air in the room was thick with all the things we couldn't say, a suffocating blend of grief and buried resentment. Ethan, of course, showed up a fashionable 30 minutes late, gliding in wearing a new designer jacket that cost more than my first car, and immediately started complaining that his barista had used oat milk instead of almond. Eventually, as I had known it would, the conversation drifted to my father's estate. My dad, a man who believed in simple fairness, had drafted a clear and simple will. Everything he had worked for was to be split down the middle between his two children. His only and ultimately fatal mistake was born from a lifetime of loving the wrong woman. He had named my mother as the executor. "You know," my mother began, dabbing her lips with a cloth napkin, "your father worried so much about Ethan. He knew his creative spirit just needed a little more support to truly flourish." I said nothing, focusing on cutting my meatloaf into precise, even squares. I had heard this overture 1,000 times. Ethan leaned back in his chair, a smug little smirk on his face. This was not a conversation. It was a coordinated maneuver. "You're so established, Sarah," she continued, her voice adopting a soft, persuasive tone she only used when she was about to make an unreasonable demand. "You have your career, your investments, you're secure. Money for you is just a number on a screen. But for Ethan, this inheritance could be the catalyst. It could be the seed money for the project that finally makes his name. It's what your father would have wanted." She was twisting his memory into a grotesque caricature, making him a posthumous partner in her grand delusion. I knew my father. He would have wanted Ethan to get a steady job and learn the dignity of earning a paycheck, not be handed another pile of cash to set on fire. "Mom," I said, my voice dangerously calm, "Dad's will is very clear. It's 50-50. "A will is just a document," she retorted, her voice sharpening. "This is about family. It's about doing what's right, and what's right is for a family to support the one who needs it most." I needed support when I was working 2 jobs and my car broke down on the I-90. The words escaped me before I could stop them. I needed support when I had to take out a loan for my certification exams. You told me that's what loans are for, and that building character was more important than a handout. A flicker of annoyance crossed her face. "That is entirely different. You're a survivor. Ethan is more delicate." Delicate, that was her word for it. In her dictionary, it was a synonym for incapable. Ethan just swirled his glass of cheap Merlot, looking profoundly uninterested. He was the imperiled prince, and I was being cast as the greedy, unfeeling sister. And that's when she made her move, the one that would change all of our lives forever. She slid the manila folder across the table, placing her hand on it with the finality of a judge passing sentence. She locked her eyes on mine. "You're not getting a dime, Sarah." It was meant as a final, crushing blow, but in that clean, surgical moment, all the years of resentment, of being the responsible one, of swallowing my own needs, they didn't erupt into a volcano of rage. They compressed into a single diamond-hard point of perfect understanding. She didn't see me as her daughter. She saw me as a financial instrument that had reached its maturity date. Ethan was the high-risk, high-reward stock. I was just the bond she was cashing out to fund her bad bet. The rules had always been rigged, and I finally realized the only way to win was to get up and walk away from the game. So I smiled. I placed my knife and fork neatly together on my plate, folded my napkin and stood. Her expression of smug victory faltered, giving way to a flicker of confusion. She had braced herself for a storm, for screaming, for tears, for pleading. She was not prepared for my stillness. "Then I truly hope you never need a dime from me." Ethan snorted into his wineglass. "Oh, please, don't be so dramatic." My mother's eyes widened slightly. "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means the Bank of Sarah is officially closed," I said, my voice as flat and emotionless as a transaction record. "I am done. I'm done being the emergency contact. I'm done with the 2 a.m. phone calls because Ethan has misplaced his rent money again. I am done co-signing for his apartments, done paying for his dental insurance, and I am certainly done being your free financial advisor and IT support. You made your choice tonight. You chose the son who is a black hole for resources, and now he is all yours. You can have all of him, the charm, the potential, and the trail of debt and destruction he leaves in his wake." I turned and walked toward the front hall without another word. "You can't just walk out," she cried, her voice now laced with an unfamiliar note of panic. "We are your family." "You just disowned me for money, Mom," I said, not even turning around. "You don't get to use that word with me anymore." As I pulled open the heavy front door and stepped into the sharp, cold Chicago air, I felt a literal weight lift from my shoulders. It wasn't anger or grief, it was liberation. She had finally, after all these years, given me permission to stop trying. And as I started my car and drove away, leaving them in the echoing silence of that dining room, I knew they had just made the single worst financial decision of their lives. They thought they were just cutting me out of an inheritance. They had no idea they were cutting their own lifeline. The first thing I did when I got back to my condo was perform a quiet digital amputation. I created new filters in my email, shunting any message from their addresses into a folder I would never open. I blocked their numbers on my phone. That premium dental and vision plan Ethan was on, the one I paid for as an add-on to my corporate benefits, canceled, effective immediately. The premium streaming bundle with all the channels that was under my name, cancelled. The automatic $500 I transferred to my mother's account on the first of every month to help with her bills and groceries, cancelled. It was a swift, clean, and bloodless procedure. For the first few months, the silence was a gift. I buried myself in a massive internal audit at work, a complex case of potential fraud that demanded every ounce of my concentration. I took a 10-day trip to the coast of Maine, something I'd never felt free enough to do before, always feeling like I had to be on standby for the next family crisis. I went hiking in Acadia National Park, ate lobster rolls by the ocean, and felt the last vestiges of obligation get carried out to sea. For the first time in my adult life, my time and my money were entirely my own. Back in Chicago, the carefully balanced structure I had been propping up for years began to shudder. The first sign of trouble came through a cousin, who mentioned at a family gathering that my mother had been complaining about how the price of everything was going up. Then the voicemails started arriving on my phone. My phone dutifully transcribed them, preserving them like relics from a fallen civilization. The first was from my mother, her voice dripping with wounded pride. "Sarah, this is your mother. I was just calling to see if you were all right. It's so unnatural for a mother to not hear from her daughter. Your father, may he rest in peace, would be so disappointed in this behavior." The next few were from Ethan. The first was casual, almost breezy. "Hey, Sarah. Weird thing. My Netflix and HBO stopped working. Tech glitch, I think. Call me back on Mom's phone." A week later, the tone was sour. "Sarah, what is happening? I got a letter saying my dental insurance is terminated. You need to call your HR department and fix this today." The final one was pure, uncut rage. "You are an unbelievable piece of work. You think you're so much better than us with your fancy job in your condo? You're going to regret this. You'll be all alone and I'll be laughing all the way to the bank." I read each transcription with the detached interest of an analyst reviewing a flawed report, and then I deleted them without a second thought. The full catastrophic implosion happened about 9 months after that fateful dinner. I pieced the story together later from my cousin and a few other family whispers. Ethan, flush with the promise of my father's entire estate, had finally launched his magnum opus. He was going to open a curated lifestyle space in the trendy Lincoln Park neighborhood. It would be a combination boutique, coffee roastery, art gallery, and event space. With no actual cash in hand from the still unsettled estate, he convinced my mother that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that couldn't wait. He found a hard money lender who gave him a short-term loan at a truly predatory interest rate. The loan, of course, required significant collateral. So Ethan, with my mother's tearful, desperate consent, had her take out a second mortgage on the family home. The brick-two flat my father had spent 35 years of his life working to own outright. The home where I grew up. Ethan, true to form, had no business plan, no understanding of Chicago's labyrinthine permit process, and no concept of cash flow. He blew through the loan money in under 3 months, spending it on an imported Italian espresso machine, custom furniture from an obscure Scandinavian designer, and a sound system worthy of a nightclub. When the general contractor presented the first major invoice for plumbing and electrical work, the account was empty. He did what he had always done. He started screening the calls. He let the certified letters pile up on the dining room table. But hard money lenders are not doting mothers. They do not accept charming excuses. The default notices started. Then came the legal filings, which my mother would sign for with a shaking hand, not fully understanding the dense legal language until the final brutal notice was posted on their front door, a formal notice of foreclosure sale. That was the day she showed up at my office building downtown. My assistant's voice came over the intercom, tinged with caution. Sarah, there's a woman at the front desk to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says she's your mother. A cold knot tightened in my gut, but I knew this day was always coming. This was the final column in the ledger. It's all right, Maria. Please send her back. She stepped into my office with its clean lines and its wide window overlooking the sprawl of the city and the gray expanse of Lake Michigan, and she seemed to shrink. This was not the proud matriarch who had cut me out of her life over meatloaf. Her clothes were rumpled, her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, and she clutched her purse like a life raft. She looked utterly terrified, a woman who had lost her bearings completely. She wasted no time on pleasantries. The story came tumbling out in a frantic, disjointed mess of blame and desperation. She railed against the vulture lenders, the unreliable contractors, and Ethan's terrible, terrible luck. She told me the bank was auctioning the house in less than 30 days. "It's the only thing I have left of your father," she sobbed, the tears finally breaking through, carving paths down her worn cheeks. "Every memory we ever made is in that house. Please, Sarah, I know what I said. I was upset. I didn't mean it. You can't let them take my home. You're the only one who can stop this." I leaned back in my leather office chair, the chair I had earned, and I steepled my fingers. I let her talk until she was exhausted, until her frantic pleas dwindled into ragged sobs. I watched her, not with anger, but with the same dispassionate focus I would use to analyze a company's balance sheet. This was the final audit. When she had fallen silent, I asked her a single question. "Let's run a hypothetical, Mom," I said, my voice quiet but clear in the still office. "Let's imagine an alternate scenario. Imagine that I was the one who failed, that I was the one who dropped out of college, who was drowning in debt, and who had just gambled away the family home on a foolish dream. And imagine Ethan was the one sitting in this chair, a successful professional with a secure life. If I had come to you, just as you have come to me, begging you to give me the entire inheritance to save me from my own mistakes, would you have done it? Would you have chosen me over him?" She opened her mouth to answer, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted around my office, at the framed certifications on the wall, at the view of the city, at anything but my face. The silence that filled the space between us was her answer. It was the most honest thing she had ever said to me. We both knew the truth. She would have told me it was time to stand on my own 2 feet. She would have called it a learning experience as she wrote a check to her golden boy. I stood up just as I had all those months ago in her dining room. "You made a strategic allocation of your resources a long time ago," I said, my voice devoid of malice. It was simply a statement of fact. "You decided which of your children was the worthy asset. It was a high-risk investment and it failed to perform. The consequences of that failure are not my liability. They belong to you and to Ethan." "But I'm your mother," she wailed, playing her last desperate card. "And you were my mother when you looked me in the eye and told me I wasn't getting a dime," I replied calmly. "Both things can't be true only when it's convenient for you. I have my own life to protect now, a life that I built by myself with no help from you. I will not set it on fire to keep you warm." I walked to my office door and held it open. "Maria at the front desk can validate your parking ticket." She stared at me, her face a mask of utter disbelief and horror, as if seeing me clearly for the very first time. She had always believed deep down that her insurance policy would pay out if she just made the claim loudly enough. As she walked past me, a ghost haunting the ruins of her own life, I didn't feel triumph. I felt a deep, solemn, and unshakable peace. They lost the house. My mother moved into a small, subsidized senior apartment on the far south side. Ethan, I heard through the grapevine, bounced between friends' couches for a while before moving to Florida, presumably in search of new investors. I have not spoken to either of them again. As for me, I continued to build. I met a wonderful man who values my strength and my mind, not my utility. I took the money I was no longer hemorrhaging into my family's crises and invested it in my own future, and it grew. But it was never about the inheritance. It was about the principle. It was about the painful, necessary lesson that you cannot be the anchor for a ship that is determined to steer itself into a hurricane. That night at the dinner table, I wasn't disowned. I was set free. I didn't lose a family. I escaped a role I had never auditioned for, and for the first time in my entire life, I was finally completely my own.